So now that we have a basic handle on navigating the Unity interface and navigating the scene view inside Unity, we're going to start to think in terms of our first simple game project. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create an environment where we allow the physics engine to take over a game object and create some kind of basic chaos inside of our game. So we won't use any player inputs in this game, but we're basically just going to create a simple physics simulation to familiarize ourselves with some of the basic concepts within Unity. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to save the scene that I'm working on. So right now we're looking at a scene view. Everything that we're looking at inside this scene is currently just happening in RAM, so it's not being saved. So I want to choose File, Save Scene, or Save Scenes. I'm going to let the location default. By default, it's using our project folder, and inside our project folder is an assets folder. And I'm going to call this LVL underscore 01. So it's short for level 1, and I'll choose to save. And once I do that, you'll see that there's a level 1 or LVL1 object, Unity scene object, that shows up inside of our assets folder. So scenes are a good way to organize content. We can think of these as different levels, and we can load scene content into other existing scenes and load and unload things. And so we'll think of these kind of like levels. So inside my current scene, I simply have two basic game objects, one that's titled cube and one that's titled sphere. And I want to get in the habit of naming these game objects as I create them or as I import them and kind of keep things organized. And so the sphere that I have, this will be, I'll simply call this ball. And so I can rename these game objects a couple of different ways. I can either click one time on the object in the hierarchy to select the object, and then left click one time on the title of the object and wait a second, and then the label will become highlighted. Okay, I'll hit return to deselect or exit the name change. Alternatively, I can select the object and right click and choose to rename the object. Or I could select the game object and look in the inspector, and the first field in the inspector includes the name of the object, and so I could rename this object floor. Now you see it's updated inside the hierarchy. So I have two objects. I have floor and ball, and I'm just going to zoom out just a bit, and I'm going to change the scale of this cube to make it feel a little bit more like a floor or a ground plane for our game to operate within. So with the floor selected, I'm going to go to the transform component. I'm going to find the scale values, and I'm going to modify the scale value of X and Z. So when I modify the scale value of X, I anticipate that it's going to get, as I increase it, it's going to get wider in the direction of the red axis. And so I'm going to change this to something like 50, and I'll zoom out a bit, and I'll make a decision about whether that's too big or too small, and maybe I'll take that down a bit so I can stay a little bit more zoomed in on this object. And so when we're talking about units inside Unity, typically we're talking about meters or degrees in some cases when it comes to rotation, but one unit inside Unity is equivalent to 1 meter. We can think of that in terms of about roughly 3 feet. If we want to think in terms of feet, I'm going to type in 30 meters for the z-axis, and now you can see that we kind of have this floor plane. I'm actually going to make it a little bit shorter on the y as well, and so I'm going to type in 0.5, so it's half of a meter. And so that just kind of changes the some of the values here, and I'm going to orbit around and flatten out my view and just kind of get a sense of what I have going on here. So I have this ball that's inside the scene, and it's sitting on top of a floor. I'm going to select the ball, and I'm actually going to move this up quite a bit. And so I can see the shadow here is giving me a basic idea of the relationship between the sphere and the ground plane. And as I move this down, if I want to get a better sense could figure out mathematically where these two are more or less going to intersect, but there's a couple of things inside our scene view that will give us some indicators of generally when they're pretty close to overlapping. One is we could look at the shadow and get a sense of how close that object is to the floor, and that's pretty close. I'm not so concerned about the object actually touching the floor, but if I want to get it a little bit closer, I could just kind of get a sense of from the shadow. But also this highlight, this orange highlight, when the object is selected, you'll start to see that when those objects start to overlap, it starts to clip that edge. So we can kind of use that as a visual indicator of how much of that object is intersecting if it's not immediately obvious through the kind of view that you're looking at. So I can lift that up a bit, and I want to make sure that my sphere is actually above my floor quite a bit, because we're gonna apply a physics simulation to this ball, and we want it to fall to the ground. So we have a floor, we have a ball. My floor is set to 30 meters along the X, half a meter along the Y, and 30 meters along Z. And that's leaving the sphere or the ball at its default scale of 1 meter. Now, scale becomes really important, particularly when we're talking about when we're bringing in 3D models from other environments, maybe Cinema 4D or Maya or whatever kind of 3D modeling environment we decide to create these assets. But it becomes particularly important when we're talking about physics simulations for reasons that we'll get into in just a bit. Scale becomes really important because when we're talking about moving through space, we're moving at different speeds and gravity is falling at certain rates. And if we make objects too big or too small relative to how our physics engine is treating them, it could make our physics feel like they're running really slow and things are really sluggish. Or if things are really super small, they might feel like they're too fast and very imprecise. And so we want to get a sense of a scale that we're working on. And it'll feel a little abstract at first until we kind of get the hang of things. But generally what I like to do to kind of understand scale inside a game, particularly a scene like this that is really abstract, is I'll make a cube, a 3D cube. And I'll move this somewhere in space just as a reference. And I'm going to make this cube 2 meters tall. Now, this cube, it's we can think of it as roughly 6 feet. It's actually taller than 6 feet, but we can think of this as kind of the height of a person. Okay? Or if we take a 1 meter cube, it's about the size of a large chair. So this will give us a sense of size and scale as we're creating new objects and bringing them into this game space. And more about that a little bit later. We'll kind of compare and contrast different game objects here once we start running some basic physics. But one of the things that's happening inside of our scene, one of the issues that we have visually is that we lack contrast inside this scene. So it's hard to distinguish the sphere from the ground and other game objects outside of just the volume and the shadow of these objects. And so what we'll do is we'll create some basic materials. This will allow us to change the color and some of the textures of the objects. And so inside the project panel, I'm going to make sure that my assets folder is selected. I'm going to right click and choose to create. I'm going to create a folder. And I'm going to call this folder materials. And once we create the materials folder, we can see that inside our project folder, and I'll just kind of resize this a little bit, we can see that inside our assets folder is the material folder, and we can navigate these folders and subfolders just as we would expect to, which is we can either double click on the material folder, and now we're inside the assets folder, inside materials, and we can see that over here in the project panel. We're inside assets, inside materials, or we can simply kind of navigate through this hierarchical list that will pop up here. So I'm going to go inside my materials folder. And in this gray panel, this shows us the contents of the folder that we have selected. I'm going to right click, choose to create, and I'm going to create a material. And this gives us a default material. It's named new material. And I'll give this just a really simple name. I'll call this either floor or ground. And with that material selected, I'm going to look in the inspector panel and I'll choose to adjust the basic color. Now, looking inside this component here, the color swatch is right in line with this albedo or albedo, and so I'm going to just select the white swatch here. We could select the eyedropper too and sample from our screen, but when we click on our swatch, this pulls up our color selector, and so we have a couple of different options in here. We can choose different types of color selectors here as I click on this little icon up here. But I prefer this hue and saturation color scale here, which would allow us to slide through the hue. And then we can choose how saturated and desaturated the color is and how much black is in it. And of course, we have these sliders over here as well. And so I'm just going to choose some kind of desaturated earthy green for my ground floor. And I'll choose this color for now, and I'll close that. So in the preview, we're getting a couple of different previews here. If I look down here at the bottom, while this material is selected, it gives me a nice large preview, and it looks kind of shiny. And that's because of the smoothness value that's being applied here. And so I could bump up the smoothness or down the smoothness, and I want this really kind of a flat matte color. So I'm just going to slide the smoothness back. I'm going to let all these other fields default. Now, if I want to apply this material on this game object, I have a couple of different ways that I can do this. I can simply click and drag and drop it onto the material or onto the object, and as you can see, depending on which object I roll over, it will highlight that object. Alternatively, I can drag and drop it directly into the hierarchy. This can be a little bit more precise, particularly when we have a lot of objects inside of your scene. But either one of those methods are appropriate. Now, because I've applied this color, if I want to change that material, all I have to do is select the root, the reference of the material in the material folder, go find the color swatch, and I can change this, and I can see that value getting updated inside the scene. So that'll update through that reference in real time. So I'll just right-click, create another material, and I'm just going to call this ball, and I'll choose kind of a nice red color. I'll keep this one a little bit shinier, a little bit smoother, but I'll take it down just a bit. And I'm not spending too much time deciding on these colors. I can always go back in and tweak them, but I just want to throw a couple colors in. We'll make some more appropriate color decisions, strategic color decisions a bit later. I also create two more materials really quickly just to have some materials to provide some contrast. And so I'll call this, this is just going to be like a charcoal type material. Again, I'm kind of naming these either based on object or based on the basic color that they're going to be. I can probably use this in a variety of places. And so just kind of want a gray. Maybe I'll add a little bit of color to it and definitely take out the shininess. Although I think I'm going to make this a little bit darker. So again, I don't want to labor too much over these colors, but I just want something that will provide a little bit of contrast inside my scene. I'll make one more material, and I'm going to call this one for now, I'll simply call it dirt, because I want kind of like a brown dirt color. And I'll choose something that's kind of in the brown, orangey brown range, and just make sure it's dark and desaturated and definitely very flat. Try that again. There we go. And again, I kind of want this like desaturated, but kind of real earthy. So just, again, just kind of playing around with a couple of the values here. And the reason I created this dirt material is I want to think of this environment. It's kind of a diorama for now. We'll add to it a little bit later, but I have this ground, and this is kind of my play area for my game. But I want a little bit of dimension. So if the user's kind of looking at this, depending on the perspective they're looking in, I kind of want this to feel like a finished environment. And so I'm going to experiment with this idea of taking the floor object and duplicating it or copying it and moving it to give it some thickness and apply a different material on it. So I'm going to select the floor. I'm going to choose to duplicate, and I can do that one of two ways. I can either right click and choose to duplicate, or I can choose Command D with the object selected on the Mac or Control D on a PC. And now I'm going to rename this, and I'll call this ground. And I'm going to just slide this down a little bit. I'm going to give a little bit of gap here, but I'll throw this dirt material on it. And I'm going to make it a little bit taller. So maybe 1 meter, maybe 2 meters, just kind of experimenting. But now I have something that adds a little bit of dimension, just a little variation, and I'll move that up. And I'm okay if there's a little bit of a gap there, creating a shadow again, just a little something to kind of make this start to feel more like an environment. Okay, so I've made some real basic aesthetic decisions. I'll come back and revisit the color choices here and a few other things about the design of the space a bit later. But I want to start to make this functional. And the way that the function of this thing is that gravity should take over and cause this sphere to fall, and then we'll influence the direction of the sphere based on some of the objects that we create and introduce into our scene. But we'll do that in the next presentation. So for now, experiment with basic materials and kind of the general aesthetic of your scene. We'll talk about physics in the next presentation, then we'll come back and revisit some of the aesthetics and the design of our space. So have fun with it, and we'll catch up in the next presentation.